Welcome back to the Old Dragoon. Today we're going to be covering the first RPG I ever played, the 1983 Menser Red Box for Dungeons and Dragons. Join us! Alright, so I agonized over what to start with on the channel. Should I go all the way back to 74 and start with Wood Grain Box D&D, or should I start where I started? And what I eventually decided to do was start where I started and use that as a reference point to move both backward and forward in time when we look at other versions of D&D. So today we're going to look at the version that I played first. This is the Red Box. This was a reformatting of the basic D&D game that came out in 1983 when TSR decided to sort of change the livery of all its games, update the trade dress, make it look more professional and more modern. So it went from the charming Errol Otis cover art of the 1980 version to a much more polished looking cover art from Larry Elmore. And this image, the image on the cover of this box, has become super iconic. I have it on a blanket. I have it on a pillowcase. I recently saw that someone makes it on underwear. I've seen it on tattoos. This image seems to say Dungeons and Dragons to a whole lot of people. Even people that weren't around or even born yet in 1983. I came across this box set in 86 when I had my first chance to actually play. What we're taking a look at here is a picture of the back of the box so you can see what came in the box set. So, this version came with 2 books, and unlike the 1980 version where one book was the rules and the other was a module, this is split for the first time into a player and a Dungeon Master book. It also comes with a set of dice, and depending on when you bought this box set, it would also have come with a crayon. Those of you who are younger might wonder, what was the crayon for? Dice were not always inked from the factory, and in fact in the early days they never were. What you did was you took a good old wax crayon, you pressed it hard into the face of the die and moved it back and forth so that the wax of the crayon would sink into the numbers on the die. And then you rubbed the excess wax away, usually with your thumb, and came away with a die that had a readable number. Now these dice were low impact plastic as opposed to all the different materials you can get dice from now. And what you ended up with was dice that would be damn near round after a couple of years of rolling them. I still have some of these dice from way back, and the D20 that I am in possession of is almost a marble at this point. And the D10, which did come from the Menser box set, it is that particular color blue that unfortunately this back image doesn't show. It got me through freshman algebra because I played the Lone Wolf books using that D10 under my desk. So anyway, this is what comes in the box. Today we're just going to talk about the first book that you'll come in contact with, and that's the player book. So let's take a look. This is the player's manual for this box set. And you'll see that there's a friendly message at the top that says, read this book first. Now, I delivered a lecture last weekend on the history of Dungeons and Dragons, and we talked about what a breakthrough it was when J. Eric Holmes, Dr. Holmes, included an actual transcript of play, an example of how D&D should be played in his Holmes Basic set. Because before that, in the white box and the wood grain box before it, there really wasn't a whole lot to go on if you hadn't played yourself or didn't have someone in your group who knew how to play. This player's manual takes that to a whole nother level completely, and we're going to take a look at exactly how. So, we get a preface from Frank Menser, we get how to use the book. Here's the table of contents, and as you can see, this is a much more modern looking layout. This also features TSR's now kind of infamous, thanks to the OSR logo and new TSR, but that's a completely different story, reuse of the logo. this is the era when we got so many iconic box sets coming out, like Marvel Superheroes and Star Frontiers, Gamma World. Well, later editions of Gamma World. But I'm getting off track. So, you'll see that the illustrations are all uniformly by Larry Elmore and Jeff Easley. They were trying really hard to get one consistent style through this series. And they would repeat that again when the Dragonlance modules came out by selecting initially Elmore to do all of the illustrations to kind of try to keep a consistent look. But here we are. Now you'll notice the player's manual by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. If you refer to some of the excellent scholarly books that have come out recently about the development of Dungeons and Dragons, you will see why Dave Arneson's name appears here, but not on AD&D. All right, so moving right along, we're going to take a look at how the book is laid out and how it helps you learn how to play. Now, what is interesting about this is delving into your first game of Dungeons and Dragons, just like this fighter who I've seen called Brannis in later publications, delving into his first dark cave. The game steps you through the concepts of Dungeons and Dragons one concept at a time. The first thing it brings you into after explaining what role-playing is ability scores. And you see that this character has a very high strength, an average dexterity, and a low average intelligence. As we go through, you fight a snake, and it explains how to make an attack roll, what a hit point is. It's bringing you into the game, as I said, one concept at a time. You meet a cleric, they explain what a cleric is, and oh, Alina the cleric. An entire generation of Dungeons & Dragons players were pretty hung up on this character, and you'll find out why here in a couple of pages. So, we find out what saving throws are and how poison works. As we move forward, there are zombies, we talk about wisdom and charisma, we talk about turning undead. We're really starting to see the world building and what different characters are capable of. There are some goblins, and then we meet Bargle, the evil mage, and we get our first taste of arcane magic. It's a magic missile, and it is a terribly unfortunate magic missile because Alina is slain. If you look around at a D&D convention, you might see a Kill Bargle t-shirt in the style of the Kill Bill movie posters. That same generation that got hung up on Alina is really wanting to get out there and kill Bargle, if they haven't already over the last 40 years. So, we find out that Alina has unfortunately expired, and we're exposed to the concept that, yes, in Dungeons and Dragons, your characters won't always live through their adventures. We finally get the full look at ability scores. We talk about alignments, how combat works, and then we look at equipment. Now you're really starting to get a handle on everything you'll need to know to create your own first character. We're introduced to the dice and the concept of why different sided dice are used for different things. And then we get a little bit of actual roleplay. We get to see the character talking back and forth with the shopkeep and haggling over some armor. We get a closer look at combat and exactly how the combat round works. And then we get into something that looks very, very familiar to those of us who played Choose Your Own Adventure books as kids. Or the Lone Wolf books that actually have random events that occur and events that can or cannot occur based on your character's abilities. So right here, we're getting to play our first Dungeons & Dragons adventure without a dungeon master. We've got a programmed adventure here telling us to go from paragraph to paragraph so that we can walk our way through our first adventure. It even shows us how to map our way through using graph paper. So, the solo adventure takes up a fair portion of the book. And at the end, you see how many experience points you earned. Once we're done with the solo adventure, we're introduced to all the different character types that can be played. So here they are in alphabetical order: the cleric, the fighter, the thief, the elf, the magic user, the halfling, and the dwarf. Players of more modern versions of Dungeons and Dragons will kind of raise an eyebrow at the fact that elf, dwarf, and halfling are classes and not races. So, in this version of D&D, and indeed the version that came before it, the Moldvay, Cook, Marsh, Basic, and Expert, dwarf, elf, and halfling are sort of archetypes of what it meant at the time in standard fantasy literature to be a dwarf, an elf, or a halfling. Very, very Tolkien-esque, and the abilities that those classes get feel exactly in that vein. So, prime requisite adjustment table. Back in those days, again, for the younger crowd out there that plays 5th edition, each class had a different chart for how fast they leveled up at a given experience point total. Your ability scores modified how much XP you got, positive or negative. You could play a fighter with the low strength, but it would take you longer to earn the experience to go up in levels, which actually might make for a pretty good story. In any case, the cleric is introduced first. You see that saving throws are not based on your ability scores, they're actually based on situations. Save versus death, ray, or poison. Save versus magic wands. Save versus paralysis or turn to stone. These numbers look static, but they're not. They're only static through 3rd level. This box set, the red box, only cover levels 1 to 3. Saving throws don't change until at least 4th level. So each of the classes will have one set of saving throws introduced. And we see the experience point table. Clerics need 1,500 to make it to level 2, and 3,000 to make it to level 3. You also see that there are titles involved. A 1st level cleric is an acolyte, a 2nd level is an adept, and a 3rd is a priest or priestess. This tells us several things. First of all, it tells us that in a strange way, characters are sort of aware of their level, but less as a sort of mechanic of how the world works, and more as where they fit within the lifestyle that they've chosen, the order that they're in, the job that they do. Also, priest appearing at level 3, or priestess, tells us that 3rd level is pretty much where a character is considered to be a fully trained professional capable of operating on their own. So at 1st level, an acolyte. Sure, you're a trainee in your religious order. At 2nd level, you're an adept. Okay, you're pretty good at what you do. But at 3rd level, you have earned a title that allows you to be the priest or priestess of a village. So that gives us kind of an idea of what the levels were intended to express. Clerics have a d6 hit die. They can wear any armor, and they can use a shield, and they can only use blunt weapons. This is based on some old historical stuff about Archbishop Turpin and not wanting to draw blood. I assure you, a mace or a warhammer will draw plenty of blood, but clerics as they appeared in D&D here and in points before could only use blunt weapons. So the cleric is almost the best fighter in the party, second only to the actual fighter among the human classes. Clerics can wear any armor, which can make them potentially pretty tough. And looking at the price of armor in this version of the game, it's pretty common that you'll be able to afford plate mail at level 1. So clerics can be pretty well protected. Now you'll notice the column that talks about spells. A 1st level cleric gets none. So there is no healing in the party at 1st level unless you get your hands on healing magic items. A cleric has to prove their devotion to their religious order before they start getting divine spells. So a 1st level cleric is pretty much a fighter relegated to blunt weaponry, except for the ability to turn undead. Now, I remember when I was 11 years old and playing D&D for the first time, I misunderstood the phrase turn undead, and I thought the character could actually become an undead creature. But no. This is the ability to frighten off, or at later levels, completely destroy undead creatures. So we have a table that shows us on 2d6 what we need to roll to turn undead. Now notice that by the time you're an adept at 2nd level, you automatically turn skeletons. And by third level, you automatically turn zombies. Those T's turn into D's at higher levels, meaning you automatically destroy a certain number of them. Now, this is done on two six-sided dice, unlike more modern versions of D&D where it's done on a D20, or indeed advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Remember that they were making D&D up as they went along, and so the idea of a unified resolution mechanic where everything was, say in the modern parlance, D20, roll high, didn't occur to them. So every different game mechanic potentially had a different resolution. So, here are our cleric abilities, including the spell casting. Clerics can learn any spell on the cleric list that they're of a proper level to learn. They do not have to keep a spell book the way magic users do. And that's pretty much the cleric. My favorite class, and the second class I played, but the class I played for the longest time. I played a wizard the first time. It didn't go well. So, the clerical spells are listed here, and a lot of them will look familiar to modern players. Cure Light Wounds, Protection from Evil, Remove Fear. The ones with an asterisk next to them can be cast in reverse, although they warn that only clerics that aren't of lawful alignment can usually get away with that. Range is expressed in feet, and a lot of spells have a permanent duration. You see that magic tends to be a little more powerful in the older versions of D&D. It's been reined in a lot. I do appreciate the artwork in the book. So we get to fighter. The fighter is exactly what it says on the tin. Use any weapon, wear any armor. The fighter requires a few more experience points than the cleric to level, and you'll notice the saving throws are very different. This shows you that the different classes are resistant to different types of attack. And that becomes important when you've got different sorts of things coming in as to who you want on your front lines and who's going to be more resistant. Dwarves and halflings have amazing saving throws. They are very, very, very resilient. So, the fighter has the titles of veteran, warrior, and swordmaster. Once again, this gives away a little bit about what's under the hood. A first level fighter being a veteran tells us that this is more than just your average militiaman that throws on an old rusty suit of chainmail and grabs a pike. This is someone who actually has some experience in combat. So a first level fighter is a different thing entirely from your average militia recruit or your average untrained human. And by third level, you're renowned as a swordmaster. Now, what is interesting about that is your attack bonus in modern parlance. In this case, there is a table that shows you what you need to roll to hit various armor classes. Doesn't change until fourth level. So the swordmaster is actually exactly as good with that sword as the veteran is, if nothing else changes between levels. So we have a recap of some of the information and the weapons list. We have a summary of all the experience point tables and abilities. This part of the book could actually be removed if you bent the staples open so that you could use it as reference sheets. Here's a look at what the character sheet would look like. Pretty simple compared to a modern sheet. Some graph paper and some pre-generated characters. But let's get back to looking at the classes, shall we? The magic user. The magic user only got one spell per day. And a spell of the first level at that. There were no cantrips back during this time. So spellcasters really only had one spell per day unless they had some scrolls on them that they could read to cast further spells. So a lot of times you ended up tossing that one magic missile or that one sleep spell and then hiding behind the fighter until you got a night's rest. So the magic user only has a D4 hit points. And remember, you didn't get a full hit die, you rolled for hit points in this version of the game. So the poor magic user had very, very low HP in most cases. You could only use a dagger as a weapon. Now, I always fudged this and allowed magic users to at least use a staff. And in a lot of cases, we let magic users take short swords or even a normal sword, mostly because we'd all read The Hobbit and Gandalf picks up the magic sword and carries it with no problems. But by the book, the magic user only gets a dagger. And with 4 or less hit points, you really want to stay off the front line. So, you have to keep a spell book in this version of D&D, and every morning you have to study your spells after a full night's sleep. This caused a lot of arguments when camping about who was going to stand watch, because the cleric and the magic user always kind of wanted to exempt themselves from being on watch because they needed that rest to get their spells back. If you found a scroll and it was a spell you didn't have, you could transcribe it into your spell book and then be able to memorize that spell later. But if you read the spell to use it, then the scroll became non-magical and it was expended. So that was something that we dealt with back in old school D&D as well. Again, the spell list is going to look very familiar to modern players, but you'll notice Charm Person actually has the ability to charm people for long, long periods of time. Now, what's interesting is when we were kids, we thought this was the most amazing thing ever. As an adult, we realized that taking away another creature's agency is kind of a creepy thing to do and not very heroic. But back in the day, Charm Person was a credit card. You could walk into the local general store, charm the proprietor, and talk them out of all sorts of things. Also, charmed soldiers would follow you around for sometimes weeks at a time, longer if they had low intelligence, which, again, as kids, we considered perfectly okay. As adults, it's a little shady. We have spells like Floating Disc, Hold Portal, Detect Magic. This one's a little rough, because if that's the only spell you can cast all day, wow. Yeah. Generally, Detect Magic only got memorized when you were back home at a safe town so that you could cast it on all the treasure you just brought home. But unlike more modern versions of D&D with much more permissive spell memorization and preparation rules, if you got the wrong spells in your spell book, you could be potentially not all that useful until you leveled up. Playing a wizard was rough in the old days. However, once they got some levels under their belt, they quickly overshadowed a lot of the other classes. So, you'll notice that at second level, magic users can cast Continual Light, which is permanent. Once somebody got Continual Light, we often did a lot of little tricks, like casting it on a coin that you could keep in a leather pouch, thereby having a light source you could turn on and off that would never run out, because Continual Light was permanent. You could also make these little trinkets and sell them to townspeople. Again, the artwork in this version is just so nostalgic to gamers of a certain age. So the Thief. The Thief leveled up faster than anybody else. The Thief had the lowest experience point thresholds for leveling up. Unfortunately, the Thief also had a D4 hit die, which made them just as fragile as the magic user. A modern Thief is something of a skill specialist and kind of a combat character. You get those sneak attack dice, and they're very, very useful. You did get Backstab as a Thief in this version, but depending on your dungeon master, getting set up to use Backstab might not be as easy as having an ally flanking the opponent like it is today. You didn't just need advantage on someone. You needed to be completely hidden, and they needed to be totally unaware of your approach. Some DMs called for a move silently and a hide in shadows roll, and that's where things started to suck, because here's the Thief's special ability table. You'll notice that even at third level, your move silently is only 30%, and your hide in shadows is only 20%. Thieves could do a lot of things, but only one of them well: climb walls. Everything else was a crapshoot, and it was very, very difficult to make some of these rolls when they counted, especially when finding a trap and removing a trap was 2 separate rolls, each of which only had a 10% chance of success at first level. Some parties resorted to having multiple thieves so they could each try to do the thing once each. And there were a lot of little rules squirreled away that said, hey, if you try to pick this lock and you fail, you can't try again until you gain a level. It was rough. However, thieves did level up pretty quickly. And they did have a fair selection of weapons they could use, including bows, which made them able to stand off and do their thing from a distance. Now we get into the demi-human classes. Dwarves basically have all the abilities of fighters, plus they can see in the dark, they speak some extra languages, and they have what nowadays we would call stone cunning. They have the ability to detect stonework. Are you moving upwards? Are you moving downwards? Does this wall slide? And things like that. Dwarves required about 10% more experience than a human fighter, and you can't tell it here since this only goes to 3rd level, but dwarves topped out at 12th level, meaning they couldn't advance as far as humans could. So there were some trade-offs to playing a dwarf. The dwarf does get the same D8 hit die as the human fighter. So, and much, much better saving throws. So it's really up to you whether you want to play a straight-up fighter or play a dwarf. The dwarf certainly gets more abilities, but there are, of course, role-playing concerns. And if the campaign's going to go on long enough, you might be worried about that level 12 cap. Most of our games did not go that far, so it really never became an issue. Elves have all the abilities of a fighter and all the abilities of a magic user with a d6 hit die right there between the fighter and the mage. The problem is the elf required almost double the XP of any other class. Literally double of the fighter if you look at this chart, 4,000 and 8,000. However, they can wear any armor, use any weapon, and cast spells from 1st level. So the elf was very, very versatile. On top of that, you got a handful of additional languages. You could also see in the dark. You were immune to ghoul paralysis. If ghouls showed up a lot in your game, that could be a huge advantage. If they didn't show up at all, it's kind of moot. But elves were fairly incredible. You just had to resign yourself to leveling up very, very slowly. And then there's the halfling. Oh, by the way, the elf is limited to a maximum of 10th level. So high enough to hit that magic 9th level and be able to participate in the sort of D&D endgame of establishing a holding and things like that, which we'll talk about when we look at the expert set. But still, it's a limitation that holds you from rising as high as the human magic user possibly could. Halflings are super resilient, and sadly they do things that the thief does better than the thief for several levels, namely hiding. So, the halfling also has great saving throws. The halfling requires about the same XP as a human warrior, and they can wear any armor and use any weapon. In fact, their prime requisite is strength along with dexterity, so they are very small fighters. They're expected to be fairly beefy. They have a d6 hit dice. And because they have a minimum of 9 in dexterity and constitution, you know you're not going to be losing hit points to a low con. They get a bonus on hitting with ranged weapons. They get a bonus to being hit by anything larger than a human. And if you're doing initiative individually, which is the way we do it all now, but back during this edition, initiative was normally done player side, monster side. But if you are using individual initiative, halflings get a bonus for it. Halflings are able to hide with a ridiculous success rate. If they are outdoors, 90% to hide as long as they stay still. Indoors, they roll a 1 or a 2 on a d6 and they hide successfully. Now this is the same ability. One is outdoors and one is indoors. You adjudicate one by rolling percentage dice and the other by rolling a d6. Welcome to 80s D&D. The halfling, by the time they reached their maximum level of 8, had saving throws of 2s or 3s on a d20. They almost always saved against every effect. Plus, as they leveled up, they got some pretty interesting abilities. Instead of saving for half damage, they automatically took half damage from certain attacks and saved for quarter damage. Halflings had some pretty cool advantages. So, to make a character in this version of D&D, ability scores are rolled 3d6 in order. So, no 4d6 drop the lowest unless your DM is letting you fudge it. So, something that's also a surprise to players of newer versions of D&D is that the luck of the dice can limit which characters you play. For instance, the dwarf, the elf, and the halfling all have minimum scores. If you don't roll that minimal score, you simply cannot play that kind of character. You could also roll very low at the ability score that's necessary for being effective at the class you really want to play. The way most of us approached it is we rolled the dice first, and then let what we rolled determine our choice of what we play, rather than the modern approach where you know you're going to create a elven paladin when you sit down, and the game mechanics support you in making that choice. In this version, it's all random, and you play the dice as they roll. If you've never tried it, give it a shot. It's actually a whole lot of fun. It's just a different experience. So you roll your scores, you choose a class. There is a mechanic by which you can exchange points on a 2-for-1 basis, but there's a set of arcane rules that tells you this cannot be raised, this can be raised, you can't take points off this. It's a little complex. But you can make some adjustments to try to get the character you want. You roll for hit points. Again, you don't get the free full hit die. Even in the 80s, it was a common house rule to start out with the maximum number of hit points for first level. You roll for money, 3d6 times 10 gold pieces. You buy your equipment, you figure out all your things like armor class and your hit roll chart. You note your ability score adjustments, choose a name and alignment, and play. Remember that in this version of D&D, there are only 3 alignments: lawful, neutral, and chaotic. And while lawful tends to be good and chaotic tends to be associated with evil, they don't necessarily mean that. There are ways to be chaotic but not be evil. There are ways to be lawful and not be good. We see that in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. In fact, we were introduced to it in the 1977 basic set, but then it was walked back in the 1981 basic set. But that's it. That's all you need to create a character in this version of D&D. So, that is the player's book. You'll notice that the ability score modifiers are standardized for 5 out of 6 ability scores. However, charisma is slightly different. Previous to this, if you go all the way back to Holmes and before, any modifiers that might appear, and there were different ones introduced at different points throughout the original white box and wood grain box run, were all very different. And in fact, in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, every ability score has a completely different chart of modifiers. This is where they all started to come together, with the exception of charisma. Before the end of the basic D&D line, even charisma would be brought in line, but not just yet. So, there we go. We have some advice on how to actually play, what alignment means, different bits of dungeoneering, how combat works. Now remember, in the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook, there were no combat rules. Combat was considered Dungeon Master information. But here, in this version, it's explicitly placed in the player book. You'll see that variable weapon damage, while I remembered it being a standard rule, is actually presented here as an optional rule. So just like the original version of D&D, all weapon attacks would do 1d6 damage, but using the variable weapon damage table, different weapons would cause different damage types. Now, one might ask, if every weapon does a d6, then what is the point of restricting what kind of weapons, say, a cleric or a wizard could use? For that, We will have a discussion when we're looking at chainmail and original 1974 D&D, because you'll find that it makes a striking difference if you're using the chainmail rules. So, we get information on how you can carry things, the D&D world, you get a glossary. The one thing that is missing that I thought really should be in here was the bibliography that was in the earlier version of the D&D basic book, with lots of books for you to go check out from your library and read for inspiration. That does not appear here, although we do get advertisements for Star Frontiers, Dragon Magazine, RPGA, and the Amazing Science Fiction magazine, which at this point belonged to TSR. So, here's an advertisement for other things that you can get to move your Dungeons & Dragons experience forward. Note that player character record sheets are still referenced here, because this was still a time where a lot of people didn't have access to a photocopier, and laser printers really weren't a thing here just yet. They'd been invented, certainly, but they weren't something that the average person was ever going to get their hands on. And that is the basic player's book for Dungeons & Dragons. This is where I started. Now, if you'll recall, the first book I was handed was the expert book. And that's because another player was taking their turn, making their character first, so I got to just sort of twiddle my thumbs and read the expert book. We're going to cover the expert book in a future video. We're going to go to the Dungeon Master's book next, and then the video after that is probably going to cover a game that isn't D&D for a little variety. But this is D&D as it existed when I came aboard in '86. The 1983 box set stayed in print for almost a decade. It was replaced shortly after I started high school by the Black box set and the Rules Cyclopedia, which combined the first 4 box sets in this 5 box set series. This basic box set is the red box. The blue box is Expert. It's followed by the Companion box, which is teal, the Master's box, which is black, and then the Immortals box, which is gold. But the Rules Cyclopedia only compiles the first 4, and Immortals was updated into the Wrath of Immortals set that went along with the Rules Cyclopedia. We'll get to all that good time. So, here we go. We're going to move along and close out the video now. Thanks for sitting down and going through my original version of D&D with me. And if you've never played this version of D&D, it is worth taking for a spin. We'll cover some modules that are a lot of fun with this particular version of D&D, and the introductory scenario in the Dungeon Master's book is really pretty neat. Frank Mentzer threw in some interesting little magic things that we'll talk about that give a player an introduction to just how weird the Dungeons & Dragons game can get. So, thanks again for tuning in to the Old Dragoon. I'll see you next time. And remember, character is what you are in the dark.